Hello, I'm Annabelle Gonzalez, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you and welcome you back to TradeWinds, our virtual event series where we discuss all topics on global trade in the era of the pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Our audience, which comes from 87 countries and counting, is also a great part of our program. So thank you all very much for being here with us today. This is our episode number 12 of TradeWinds, and we will discuss what trade policy priorities for the Biden administration, a topic that is top of mind for global leaders, government officials, business executives, and trade policy wonks from across the world. So to lead our conversation, I am very excited that we have with us two outstanding experts with hands-on experience in U.S. trade policy making. Let me first introduce Ambassador Michael Froman, who is Vice Chairman and President for Strategic Growth for MasterCard. Ambassador Froman previously served as U.S. Trade Representative in the Obama administration, and before that as Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economic Affairs, among other distinguished roles in the public and private sector. You probably know that Mike was the architect of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I also remember him as the lead force behind the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, up for some 4 or 5 days and nights in a row in Bali, trying to bring the negotiations to fruition. So I think he's basically a trade negotiator at heart. Although he needs no introduction, I'm also very pleased to welcome my wonderful colleague, Chad Bown, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute. Chad served as a senior economist for international trade and investment in the White House on the Council of Economic Advisors and a senior economist at the World Bank. He was also a visiting scholar in economic research at the WTO. Along with Sumaya Keynes, Chad is the co-host of Trade Talks, which is my all-time favorite podcast on international trade policy. So welcome to both of you, and thank you very much for being here with us at TradeWinds. I will turn to Mike and Chad in a moment. And as always, for you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform. And we will try to get to as many of them as possible. So as President-elect Biden prepares to come into office on January 20, 2021, the world awaits with expectation the trade policy agenda of the new administration. After 4 years of unconventional views, objectives, and instruments in dealing with trade matters, most countries are looking forward to the U.S. coming back to its leadership role. And I think that this sentiment was well captured by Peter Altmaier, Germany's economy minister, who reflected that most EU members saw this as an opportunity to realign trade relations, he said, to resolve trade conflicts, and to contribute to a more rules-based, multilateralist, anti-protectionist global trade relationship. Now, that the Biden team has a positive view towards global cooperation and multilateral institutions provides room for hope. So does the perception that the more formal processes and procedures for policymaking will be reinstalled. Now, some tensions may get in the way of a smooth reset of America's global trade leadership and a more constructive trade agenda. And let me mention 3. First, while a change in tone will bring renewed momentum and goodwill to the Biden administration, the U.S. has lost significant political capital abroad. Good deeds, in addition to good intention, will be required to rebuild trust. And as countries grew apart from the U.S., it may not be feasible to just come back to where we were before. Second, much has happened on the trade front in these 4 years, from tariffs to strained relations to conflict with China to WTO turmoil, and it will take time and effort to untangle all this. While some measures could be unilaterally withdrawn, that is not the case of others. And as real problems underlie some of the frictions, new strategies and complex negotiations will be required to sort them out. And third and most important, there is the domestic dimension. Trade will compete with other priorities, though it could also have a role in supporting health, growth, foreign policy, and the environment, among others. Buy America and other policies to reignite manufacturing could lead to trade conflict depending on how they are implemented. Some part of the party that will come to govern is skeptical on trade, and it is not clear yet who will be in control of the US Senate. In addition, of course, there is still the pandemic and its economic fallout to deal with. So within this context, let me now turn to Mike and ask you, in your view, what could be the goals and priorities for the Biden administration on trade policy, and how could they go about it? Mike.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, Annabelle, and it's great to share the screen with Chad as well. You brought back sort of PTSD memories of Bali being about 5 nights in a row to get that agreement done. Let me start with the caveat that I don't work for or advise the Biden campaign or the Biden transition, so these views are solely my own, and I'm just slightly more attentive observer of democratic trade politics, perhaps, than most. I think you are right that the new administration is likely to have greater stability, predictability, a greater focus on being collaborative than the current one. But I would not assume that it's going to be any less tough on the substantive underlying issues. And I do think there is actually a high risk of miscalculation by our trading partners, including those in Europe, who sort of assume that everything is going to be sweetness and light going forward. I think the issues that have been at issue between us, between ourselves and other trading partners, are very much likely to remain, and they're likely to remain a focus in need of getting resolved, not swept under the carpet. Having said that, I think there will be a great possibility for doing further collaboration with allies and partners on issues of common interest, like China, WTO reform potentially, and I'd say a whole series of next generation trade issues, digital trade, for example, COVID-related trade matters. And Chad has been the author with Thomas Pollocky of a very important article on that issue. Going back to some issues like the environmental goods agreement, where perhaps we could finally make progress and get that over the line, which had stumbled between China and the EU over bicycles. I think with 4 years of hindsight, perhaps, and the increasing importance of climate change, we could perhaps get something like that over the line, and maybe something further in the healthcare area more generally. With regard to China, China will be front and center on the new administration's agenda broadly, including regarding trade, but broader than that. I think it will be important that it's a very mature relationship, that we find ways of cooperating where we can cooperate, where we need to cooperate, like climate change, that we manage conflicts where we have them, potentially around the South China Sea, that we continue to pursue issues that we have differences over, like human rights, and at the same time work to resolve the underlying trade and investment issues, the skepticism around which I think has very much led to this shift in opinion by the American public and the creation of a bipartisan consensus that is much more negative on China than it has been in the past. Those issues need to be front and center, building on the phase one deal, focusing on issues like state-owned enterprises, subsidies, forced technology transfer, intellectual property rights protection, reciprocal market access. Those need to be on the table, and there need to be ways that a new administration conveys clearly what its requirements are and in a predictable, stable manner, so that China can respond with what it's willing to do to help reset the relationship. With the Asia Pacific, I think there's an opportunity to engage in areas like the digital economy and perhaps build on some of the work that's been done with the USMCA, leveraging what had been negotiated in TPP, US-Japan agreement, some of the things going on in Asia Pacific themselves, to help build out better standards, higher standard rules on technology issues, digital economy, data flow, privacy issues, as a way of helping to advance the rule setting agenda. With the EU, there are a lot of outstanding issues and increasing every day. We've got the Airbus Boeing issue to resolve, There are issues around the digital services tax, issues around border adjustment tax, and how to make sure that that doesn't become a new fissure between the United States and Europe. But there too, I think there's a potential to work together on digital trade, COVID, e-commerce, environmental goods, other health-related areas as a way of advancing the agenda. On the WTO, I think the focus in the near term is likely to be on the new DG, Director General, picking a new Director General, and on the appellate body reform, right? Continue to believe there should be a landing zone that the U.S. could agree to with other parties who are now willing to really engage in a discussion of WTO reform. I'll mention three last things. I'm sorry for taking so long. Bilaterals, there's the UK agreement, which I continue to believe needs to fundamentally wait until the UK defines its relationship with the European Union so that we know how much latitude London has to agree to provisions that may be at odds with European standards. Kenya, I think, will continue along the path that it's on. I'd say something on enforcement. We've now negotiated even stronger enforcement procedures, for example, regarding labor, with the input of Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator Wyden and others. It's going to be important that those obligations be fully implemented and that the enforcement tools are used and used well. And then finally, but it's actually the most important one, all of this should be looked at in the context of the domestic policy agenda in the US. The area where successive administrations have not been able to necessarily deliver on what they had hoped to deliver has been on coming up with systems for preparing American workers to succeed in a rapidly changing economy. Whether that change is coming from technology, where economists think the vast majority of it comes from, or from globalization, we just don't have the kind of portable benefits, lifelong learning, adjustment assistance, mobility assistance, et cetera, to help workers succeed and thrive in a changing economy. And that's where President-elect Biden's focus on building back better and on focusing first on the domestic agenda before engaging in major international trade negotiations, I think is very well placed.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for this sort of tour on so many issues that are on the table right now, Ambassador. Let me now turn to Chad. As part of the Peterson project on rebuilding the global economy, Chad, you recently wrote a memo for the next U.S. trade representative on the trade policy and suggested a trade policy to-do list. So what did you tell the next USTR?
So thank you. Here it is. This is the memo. And just to kind of set it up for everybody, this is actually very reminiscent for me of my stint of working in government. So I'm sure people don't know, but my one stint of working for government, I effectively worked for Mike. And so in the first couple of years of the Obama administration, before he was U.S. Trade Representative, Mike was kind of running international economic policy in the White House at the National Economic Council, and I was at the Council of Economic Advisors. And so I would kind of go and hang out with his group and say, hey, Mike, what can I do? And he would say things like, hey, Chad, write a memo about what the priorities should be that we should be working on. So when I was writing this memo, I very much had Mike in mind. And I won't go through all of it, but there's a couple of points there. And again, most of them are just piggybacking on the things that Mike already laid out, which are, the obvious priorities for the next administration. So the very first bullet point on my memo was essentially to reset the relationship with allies. Because, if we're thinking about long-term, what the challenges are with China and in addressing those in a trade sense, this approach of really going at it alone with tariffs, and you're not really making a whole lot of progress there on tackling some of the fundamental long-run issues, whether you're thinking about state-owned enterprises or forced technology transfer or the kind of broader Chinese system. And these are challenges that allies, quote unquote, share, but there hasn't been the engagement to work together. And I think in order to get there, we do need to clean up a lot of the bilateral frictions that Mike mentioned, and that would include, the sort of inevitable trade frictions that come up that are still out there on digital services tax, on Boeing, Airbus, on some of the WTO issues. But beyond that, we do have these other complicated ones that we introduced as well. And so what I would write as the economist to my boss would be, let's look at these tariffs that we've imposed. The steel and aluminum tariffs, for example, our trading partners at the allies are not happy with those. They've retaliated against us because of them, and they're hurting us ourselves in terms of raising the cost of our inputs. Let's look at those again. Even if we somehow can't remove them for purely economic reasons, there's also reasons at the WTO that we need to rethink how it is that we impose them, because using this national security loophole has created a really big problem for the trading system that is potentially going to be forced to rule on these through dispute settlement. It's putting the WTO dispute settlement system and the panels in a really awkward position about deciding whether or not these things are really done in the United States' national security interests or not. You don't want to have the WTO relying on. So we've got to deal with this somehow. How are we going to do that? Could we use Section 201 instead? Should we think about something more radical, renegotiating our tariff bind? If we have to have higher protection for the steel industry for some reason, should we renegotiate our tariff bindings on steel and kind of proceed in a more multilateral friendly way to tackle this kind of problem? So I would kind of lay out some of those as potential options there. Another one that I would throw out in the context of the phase one agreement is I, as an economist, don't think this purchase commitment approach is a particularly good idea. It creates the wrong incentives for China. We didn't negotiate away all of the most of the retaliatory tariffs that China has imposed in the context of the trade war. So those are sitting out there, making it, there's no private sector incentives for the private sector in China to actually buy from us as opposed to buying from Europe or Japan or Brazil, depending on the product that you're talking about. So to the extent that China's making progress with these purchase commitments, it's going to be Chinese state-owned enterprises. And those are the things that we were fundamentally worried about in the first place. So aren't we adding to the additional problems instead of fixing them? That's one of the economic reasons why to get rid of this. If China's making progress, there's the concern that they're doing so at the expense of our allies by trade diversion, just buying from us instead of buying from Europe or Japan or Canada or Brazil. And so I think there's really, really big economic reasons why we should think about an alternative approach with phase one. So I have those kinds of arguments, and there's more in the memo. But can I ask Mike a question? Because I, as somebody who had to deal with a scenario like this, right? So when Mike was leading the sort of the international place in the National Economic Council in 2009, especially, it was a similar economic time, and in that the focus really needed to be on the domestic economy, given the severity of the global financial crisis and the elevated levels of unemployment and poor economic growth in the United States. So with your boss at the time, how did you nevertheless convince him that, yes, we need to focus on home and worry about our domestic policies, but there are these other things out there that we can't ignore as well? And what advice would you give to the advisors of President-elect Biden, the foreign, the international economic policy advisors, to say, yes, we do need to focus on these things at home, but there are important things going on in the global economy, and RCEP, things like that. We're getting left behind if we don't engage on these things. How did you do it effectively, and how would you convince or advise your followers to do something similar?
Well,
Well,
look, this is a different kind of crisis than the 2008, 2009 crisis, but there are some lessons to be learned. And certainly one is that we ought to show more U.S. leadership in utilizing the mechanisms that are out there, like the G7 and the G20, to make sure that there is a coordinated response to this global pandemic and global economic downturn. The rest of the world has gotten together around the pandemic with COVAX and the various international collaborative efforts. We're actually doing some things from the private sector with the Gates Foundation and Wellcome Trust to help accelerate the dispersion of therapeutics and diagnostics. With a new administration, having the U.S. engage in that as well to ensure that, well, we certainly need to take care of the American population, which is the population in the world that is most affected by COVID. We also want to make sure, from even our own self-interest, that effective treatments, diagnostics, and vaccines make their way around the world in an appropriate way. So having US at the table for that is going to be important. Same thing on the economic side. We should be looking at how are the international financial institutions doing in terms of dealing with the economic crisis? Do they have the resources that they need if there should be debt crises in a number of emerging economies, as every economy tries to stimulate their way out of this crisis? Where are the risks in the international system, and where would international coordination be helpful? So that's that linkage between the domestic and the international. Our economy will be very much affected by how this pandemic gets managed and how the economic crisis around the world gets managed, and using all of our international tools to support that domestic effort and that domestic priority is an important one. The other thing that you mentioned is, look, no administration has the luxury of doing one thing at a time. You've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And we've had 4 years of withdrawal from the Asia Pacific, for example, while China has continued to exert itself, whether it's through the Belt and Road Initiative, through its other institutions, or more recently with the completion of RCEP. And so I don't think you can wait 2 or 3 years to begin to re-engage with this vitally important region of the Asia Pacific, and finding the right way to do so, so that countries will come to the table and engage with us, and we can begin to reaffirm our role as a Pacific nation. I think will be absolutely critical in the short run. That's different than saying, let's go launch a big new trade negotiation. I agree with the Vice President-elect that we've got to focus on, the President-elect, that we've got to focus on rebuilding our domestic situation before we engage further in those kinds of negotiations. And we need to make sure we're addressing the critical outstanding issues of labor and environment, and what needs to be done domestically to support American manufacturing and American workers.
That's very good. Let me take, I mean, you've touched upon many important issues. Let me focus on the WTO for a moment. We have a question. We have actually a couple of questions coming from our audience on the WTO, so I'll try to bring them together. One from Mark Agnew says, what is the low-hanging fruit that U.S. allies can advance to ensure that the new administration sees a relevance in international institutions like the WTO? We have another one that from an anonymous attendee that says, there is a disquieting parallelism between the U.S. refusal to support the consensus candidate for the WTO DG and the refusal of the current administration to acknowledge the outcome of the election. Is a Biden administration likely to start off its tenure by joining the consensus in Geneva to signal a renewed commitment to multilateralism? And I will add to this one question from my side, which is, the WTO has great potential in many areas, including in the area of health that you were mentioning, Mike, and that is so essential for the U.S. and for all countries, quite frankly, and for the recovery. Do you think that a Biden administration would basically invest the time and energy that will be required to rebuild the WTO, and would you advise them to do so?
So I think I have a rather unpopular view, at least for this audience, on the WTO. I would focus on elements of WTO reform, such as resolving the deadlock around the appellate body, because I do believe that having binding and enforceable rules in the international system is very much in the U.S. interest. We tend to win most of the cases, the major cases that we bring, and it's been an important part of holding other countries' feet to the fire. There are those who want to go back to the GATT period, where any country that was accused of violating trade rules was able to prevent any meaningful enforcement of those rules against it by simply obstructing the appointment of a new panel or things of that sort. But I think the world has moved on since then, and we should find ways of resolving it. And I think the rest of the world, including all the candidates who put themselves up to be director general, but also most of the major trading countries are willing to come to the table and talk about WTO reform. I think that is the easiest and the most important one to get resolved. But in terms of the WTO being an institution for multilateral negotiations, it is, as you pointed out, Annabelle, it's exceedingly hard to reach consensus among 164 countries. The only meaningful agreement that was done in the WTO's history was the trade facilitation agreement at that level. And so I think it's more likely that I think one, if there's going to be negotiations, it should be probably plurilateral agreements, coalitions of the ambitious coming together, setting rules, advancing the agenda, whether it's under the WTO or otherwise. But I also think instead of focusing so much on the institution or on multilateralism itself, we should be investing the energy in rebuilding a consensus, a political consensus among the major trading countries as to what the trading system is for, what the rules should be. And that goes back to working with allies and partners. Sometimes I feel like some of our trading partners, I'll use Europe as an example, really focus on multilateralism and WTO as an end in and of itself, and don't invest the same time and energy in building the political consensus to make those institutions work. And I think we've seen the results of that. We need to look at first principles, work with our partners and allies around the world, build consensus as to how we want to move the international economy forward in a way that works for all of us, and then figure out what the right mechanism is for doing so. It may be the WTO, it may be plurilateral, it may be regional, it may be bilateral, maybe a combination of several different initiatives, but I focus more on the substance of the consensus rather than on the institution per se.
You know, it's interesting. We had on Monday in another event at the Pearson, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, one of the leading candidates actually for the WTO DG position, and she was saying something about looking for a sense of purpose for the WTO, which I think comes to your point about allies and countries actually discussing, how can they reach consensus on what is the role of the system to support some of these important priorities. And I think that is probably, I would say, one of the most important challenges of the next Director General. Let me now turn over to you, Chad, because you've been talking. You mentioned in your remarks how is it that the EU and the US, or I mean, not the EU and the US, but the US could proceed as regards some of these metal tariffs. And this is an important issue because I think some of the allies, certainly in Europe, but also elsewhere, are looking into this. Do you think that, would you recommend a Biden administration to follow one of these alternative routes? And in addition to this, do you think that it is important for allies to begin to think, what would they bring to the table should the US move in this direction?
So I think that those are kind of the key issues. I'm not sure I've settled. I mean, the economist in me says, let's deal with the economic cost of the tariffs, but at the same time, after 4 years, we've made no further progress on tackling what the underlying source of the problem that led to the tariffs was, which was, the Chinese overcapacity in some sense and system of subsidies. And my concern is if we don't, whether that might be what I was proposing, a good short-run economic solution, if we don't fix the underlying systemic problem with China, then we could very shortly end up back at the same place. So I do think it needs to be thought of as part of a longer-term strategy. I guess what I would add in there that we need to probably go back to is, and this is Mike's introducing unpopular things, I'm going to introduce even more unpopular things, which was kind of the OECD's, Steel Forum to figure out how we can get together and, and negotiate over these types of issues. I think, to be honest, it probably needs to be combined with broader thinking about rules on subsidies. The OECD has been doing a lot of work analytically for a number of important sectors, trying to identify where the subsidies are, how big they are, and then getting to the question of how problematic they are for trading partners. Right now, I think the negotiators, to the extent that they're talking about new rules in this area, are doing so not guided by enough economic facts to understand where the sources of the problems are, where they're meaningful, and where we need to tackle them. So I think that's what I would argue is you could do that, you should do that, but I think it needs to be combined with the bigger effort of tackling the international issue as well, including with allies. It ties into one other point that Mike mentioned that I want to go back to, and I want to push him on a little bit as well. And so I was actually surprised. I thought he was a bit more optimistic about appellate body reform than I might have anticipated, or maybe more optimistic than I am. And my question for him is, do you think that this is achievable as a siloed issue? Can you just deal with appellate body reform, fixing that in and of itself? The concern for me is that, on the American side, the worry is, well, we don't have acceptance on international rules on subsidies. We don't know yet if we can use countervailing duties or whatever we need against China because of this issue of public bodies, that their state-owned enterprises grant subsidies or not. And until all of these things get clarified, sort of none of them get clarified. So do you think that the appellate body issue can get resolved in a silo, or does it need to be packaged with some other things like potentially new rules on subsidies to tackle some of the underlying issues as well?
Yeah, I think while I'd love for there to be a WTO reform round where lots of issues were put together, I think that's probably a recipe for a decade-long negotiation. And so I'd rather harvest what can be harvested. In this case, I think we can resolve some of the fundamental appellate body issues, which the Trump administration has, brought the appellate body to a deadlock, but they predated the Trump administration, some of the same concerns. So making sure that it's not creating new law, that it's living by the context of the agreement, that it's doing its work in a timely fashion, those ought to be things we can reach agreement on with other countries as a condition of getting the WTO back to being a functional organization. And that doesn't preclude having a parallel discussion around subsidy disciplines and things of that sort, but I think those are going to be much longer term in nature.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question here from our friend from the EU, Ignacio Garcia Bercero, who's asking a very practical question. Who to engage with to discuss some of the most urgent or pressing issues, say the DG appointment, some of the disputes in the new administration. So if, who to talk to before a new USTR comes in place, which may take a few months, I guess.
Well, look, we have a tradition in this country of there being only one president at a time. And President-elect Biden and the transition team have made clear that they are living by that tradition. And in fact, they're being particularly careful in limiting the amount of engagement with foreign counterparts during the campaign. There was none, and during this period, it's very limited. And so it won't be that long before there is a new administration in place, and where some of the key economic officials will be known. And I would encourage Ignacio, my old friend and counterpart, to engage with them at that time.
Thank you, Mike. Let me turn to China. Both of you have made reference to a number of points. So I want to ask both of you what to do with the Section 301 tariffs and the Phase 1 agreement. The purchase commitments, I know that Chad doesn't like, and very rightly so. He's been very, very clear the reasons for it. But more importantly, how to move forward on the trade relation with China, addressing some of these structural concerns that are generating the frictions in the bilateral relationship, but more broadly in the trading system. So Mike, you want to come in?
Sure. Well, look, I think the phase one agreement is imperfect in many ways, and as Chad has tracked very carefully, there's still a ways to go before it meets even its limited ambitions. But I don't think there's any reason to jettison it. It's more, I think, to focus on what's the next stage. How do you get to those important structural reform issues that have been put to the side when the phase one agreement was formulated? And there, I think the real question is, what is China willing to do on the economic side in order to reset relations? The issues are well known. They've been out there for a while. Some will remember near the end of the Obama administration, we were negotiating a bilateral agreement with China that dealt with many of them. We didn't complete it, but we had dealt with state-owned enterprise disciplines, subsidy disciplines, disciplines on technology transfer, intellectual property rights protection, and market access. And picking that up and figuring out both how to raise it to the next level and making sure that those obligations are clear and enforceable, I think is going to be a key area of discussion with China. And I think the challenge is, and I think the Chinese leadership, as you hear them speak at conferences and things, they're very pragmatic. I think they understand that there needs to be a change there. My guess is they're more willing to do reforms on the economic side than they are on the political side or the human rights side. But it means being able to convey from our side what clearly we expect of China in terms of living by a set of market-based rules, and then China making the decision as to which of those things it's really going to commit to. And for years we've been telling China that if they don't make progress on these issues, then support for a constructive relationship with China was going to disintegrate. And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. And that's what we see in the polls in the United States and around the world. That's what we see in the political consensus in the United States and around the world. And that's not in China's interest. And so hopefully they're recalculating what they're willing to do given the shift in public and political opinion against China around the world. And hopefully we can engage with them in that kind of negotiation.
Thank you.
But it's got to be. But I just got to emphasize, it's got to be concrete, real resolution that is clear and that is ultimately enforceable. I think people are tired of negotiating communiques that have good language but don't lead to action. What they want is action that has an impact on the hard underlying issues. And only China can really decide what it's willing to do with its state-owned enterprise sector, what it's willing to do on subsidies, and it's really in their court to take the action necessary to reset the relationship.
Thank you, Mike.
I just wanted to add one point to that, just in practical terms. So, to their credit, the Trump administration had been working with the European Union and Japan in this trilateral process and trying to think about some new rules on industrial subsidies, for example, that might be part of a more formal conversation with China on this. Not a big WTO round of reforms, but in this particular area. And I think one of the implicit criticisms that I would have with even the Obama administration's approach and thinking about a lot of these issues is it's just not, even back then in the bilateral investment treaty framework, which was the context in which these things were being negotiated at the time, a lot of these just aren't bilateral issues. And so finally, if we do get agreement between the United States, Europe, Japan on where to start, and then we can bring that to China to talk further, I think that's a useful approach. And I think it was on TradeWinds earlier this summer where we had a conversation with the Chinese ambassador to the WTO on this point. And he, didn't like my paraphrasing. He didn't like the rules and said no to begin with, but then engaged in a substantive conversation about what they disliked about the rules that were sort of out there at the time, which I think was constructive and showed a willingness to kind of engage on the topic. So I'm hoping that there's a launching point there for actual serious conversations on those types of issues, at least.
That's very good. I like that positive attitude. So we have over 40 different questions, but I want to take 3 topics that are recurrent in some of the questions that we're getting. And one is to the point of U.S. engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. And Mike, you're making reference to this, that, particularly in light of TPP, RCEP, whatever, the U.S. cannot really sit on the sidelines for 3 years waiting for something to happen there. And we have questions that several people ask, will or should the U.S. rejoin CPTPP? We also have our good friend Lu Chang Kung asking, Mike, what do you think about RCEP? And more broadly, how should the U.S. position itself in that region of the world?
So look, at this stage, I think it would be most productive to re-engage with that region of the world using some of these new issues like the digital economy as a foundation. There's been, again, good progress from TPP to USMCA to the US-Japan agreement in terms of setting some standards in that area. Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, I believe, have also been engaged together on these issues in various bilateral or trilateral agreements. It is the next frontier of the global economy. These issues around data flows, privacy, localization, nationalism, et cetera, play a very important role in the evolution of the ecosystem that's so important to innovation around the world. So, and I don't think it has as many of the political sensitivities as a traditional free trade agreement back here in the United States. So my recommendation is to find areas of potential common interest, whether it's the digital economy, whether it's talking about COVID and healthcare and supply chains, whether there are issues around environmental goods that could be form the foundation of getting countries back to the table together. And part of it is about the substance, and the substance is important, but also part of it is just about the process of pulling countries together, creating habits of cooperation, creating a mechanism for the U.S. to re-engage and to exert leadership and its role in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that would go a long way towards reaffirming our role as a Pacific power.
Mm-hmm. I think what you're saying is interesting in the sense, Mike, that this is not like, the U.S. back and on day one, everything would be sorted out. No, I mean, this would be a process. This is an ongoing process. This will take, several iterations. Many things need to be rebuilt, and this will take some time, right?
And I guess what I would just say is, from my conversations that I have now in outside of government, there's a great interest and willingness across the Asia Pacific for the U.S. to re-engage. Countries are eager for the U.S. to come back to the table, and I think would find ways to work with the U.S. On areas of mutual interest. The region has changed in 4 years, and the U.S. will need to take that into account. RCEP now exists. The Belt and Road Initiative is much further developed. China's intentions vis-a-vis the region are much clearer, but there's a role for the United States, and there are willing allies and partners in the region who very much want us to be there.
Thank you, Mike. Chad, you just put out an episode of Trade Talks where you talked about RCEP, and I thought it was a very interesting episode. I listened to it this morning. What is your take on RCEP right now?
I mean, I was so busy putting together the episode, I didn't quite get a chance to read all the footnotes or the however many thousands of pages of tariff schedules to know exactly when everything is phased in. My broad sense is that there's two main contributions, and I think that this is important because they're kind of going in the opposite direction of how the United States has gone the last 4 years. RCEP rationalized a number of elements of the existing free trade agreements, noodle bowls in that area of the world, which were very, very complicated, which meant that businesses didn't necessarily get to take advantage of all the tariff preferences that were there. So by kind of simplifying some of the rules of origin, making it easier for firms to be able to source from different countries within the region, I think would allow them to take even more advantage of local supply chains, and they're already prevalent in the region. So that's one. The second big element, though, is just this undeniable feature that it's a free trade agreement between China, Japan, and South Korea that never existed before, right? So China, South Korea had a bit, but Japan never did with China. Japan never did with South Korea, and China and South Korea have relatively high MFN tariffs, at least from Japan's perspective. So there could be a lot more integration there as well. And the broad sense was, well, they were building an agreement that was going to lead to more intra-regional trade and yet not be one that also erected walls toward the outside world. And so I thought that was interesting because it's obviously very different from what we saw in terms of the USMCA negotiations, where there was very much a drive by the United States administration to increase the value, the regional content for automobiles and effectively put walls up toward the rest of the world. So I thought that was super interesting. They're continuing to go forward, and I think this just goes back to Mike's point that we need to re-engage in that region, because without doing so actively on behalf of American exporters of physical goods, or if we're talking about digital and rules there, we're losing out, and we're losing out with the ability to be a part of what is actually happening in that region.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. I mean, one could continue talking about each of these issues for a very long time, but we have close to 50 questions now, so I want to bring some more in. So another topic that several people have brought is the EU is preparing strong actions towards carbon neutrality, which includes a carbon border adjustment tax. And how do you expect the Biden administration will react to this, given that climate goals are an important part of the agenda? This is from Christian Bluff, but we have some 3 or 4 questions that look into the trade climate change dimension. So Mike, you want to come in?
Sure. Well, clearly climate change is one of the top priorities for the incoming Biden administration, and I would expect them to be exploring all the ways in which we can address climate change. I think the specific issue of a border adjustment tax, to me, just underscores, first of all, it underscores the need for international collaboration. Because if every country or every region goes their own way in terms of how to define this, implement it, it's likely to be the source of a lot of controversy and tension and conflict, as opposed to progress. So to the degree that the incoming administration is open to this idea, I think it just underscores that this ought to be one of the issues, the nexus of climate change and trade, and what the appropriate way to deal with both ought to be on the agenda when we sit down with our European allies and partners and begin to sketch out an agenda of collaboration.
Okay, very good. Chad, your view on this point?
Yeah, I am very much in agreement with that, and I think this is an area where the United States first and foremost needs to tend to its own backyard, right? And so, in principle, border carbon adjustment can kind of be trade neutral or WTO consistent, but you need to have the domestic policies in place. Say a carbon tax within the United States to deal with our own sets of issues. So I think, and I agree with Mike, it sounds like this is going to be a big priority for an incoming Biden administration. That being said, it's not going to be easy. We've been trying to deal with this in the United States for a long time now without as much progress as we would like. But I also agree that it's not going to help to have international friction on the issue, unfortunately.
Yeah. Another topic that is of great interest to our participants is the digital economy and a potential for a digital agreement. And Mike, you've been making reference to this point as well. So we have Hildegun Kivik Nordas asking, on the digital economy, there appears to be a large divide between the US, EU, and China on important issues such as data flows, privacy, and localization. Do you see a landing zone here?
So I think I think there is a potential one, actually, and I think it's critically important that we try and bring people together to identify it. Let me say a couple things about it. One is, let's just take the issue of privacy. It is an absolutely critical issue, and the European Union has played a leadership role in defining certain privacy standards that now, in one form or another, make their way into other jurisdictions as well, California or elsewhere. But I'll just use that as an example because there's a danger and a tendency to conflate privacy and the need to control or localize data. There are many ways to protect individual privacy while not sacrificing the benefits of innovation or development that come from being able to share data across borders and do data analytics and the like. And I think that's the conversation we need to get into. It's not about whether there should be privacy protections or not. There should be, absolutely. An individual should own their data, should control their data, should benefit from their data, and the job of others is to protect their data. But finding a system that protects that and respects those principles, but that also allows for the benefits of data analytics, which are adding so much to everything from health to cybersecurity to our ability to deal with climate change or any number of other things where we rely on access to data from across borders. That's the key issue that we need to try and address. Some of it can be done in the trade space. I think another way of looking at it is, this is a new area where every country, there's a risk that every country will go its own way in terms of setting up regulations that will create a lack of interoperability, an archipelago of regulations, really pulling apart and decoupling into not just 2, but 3 or 4 or 5 islands of regulation around the world. It might be appropriate to do, as some have suggested, and create something like the Financial Stability Board for technology. Or I've seen a proposal for the Tech 10, or a proposal for a technology alliance. The idea of bringing together like-minded countries to try and address these issues and to build out from there, and to make sure that we are, again, respecting certain fundamental principles like privacy, but at the same time, making sure we're not creating unnecessary obstacles to the innovation and the positive value that a digital economy can provide.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike. Chad, do you have any comments on this point?
Only to say that I think the world is just seemingly every day getting more complicated in this space, because to me, digital is wrapped up not only in the issues that Mike talked about, but digital services taxes and how they've been brought into the trade space as well through the Section 301 investigations and the failure to kind of come up with a multilateral solution for international tax reform at the OECD. Some of the US-China conflicts, with TikTok. In the United States now, we're seeing antitrust actions on some of the big tech companies, right? Google. And with the Biden administration, there are some folks within the Democratic Party that have very strong views about maybe tightening some of the regulations on some of the big tech companies. So I think this is a complex space, and all of these things are related. Still a little bit unsettled in the domestic context, I think, which then provides challenges to figure out, well, what should our international negotiating position be on a lot of these issues? So yeah, going to be one to watch.
Yeah. So we're getting closer to the end of our episode, unfortunately. But I want to ask you, Mike, and then Chad as well. How about the rest of the world? Because we have a number of questions coming from Latin America, coming from Africa, and a lot saying, well, you know, would the U.S. be open for a bilateral FTA? And if not, but rather than focusing on that, I would like to ask you, how would you advise these countries to engage with the U.S.? Not thinking about an FTA right now, but how could they engage on trade with the U.S.? So, Mike, you want to come in?
Well, look, I think once there's a new team appointed and they've dealt with the immediate onslaught of issues, and there's a whole list of things that statutorily are required, and for whatever reason, in the first 3 or 4 months of the year, lots of reports to be issued and things of that sort on the trade side. So there'll be a lot to do, I think, in the first few months of the administration just to get on top of what's in the inbox, so to speak. But I think coming up with creative ways to engage, given the nature of the discussion that we've had in this country over the last several years around trade. Look, on the positive side, as the Pew Foundation polls show, the American public has never been more positive about international trade than they are today. More than 70% of the American public feel positively about trade. And even the American public has always felt positive about it as a consumer. They understood that they're able to provide for their family at a more affordable rate because of trade. But now even a slight majority view it as a positive from the perspective of supporting jobs and wages in the United States. Just 51%, but that's an increase over time. So it's not that the the American public is inherently protectionist. In fact, we've seen debate around protectionism versus trade wars over the last few years and the pros and cons of putting trade barriers in place. Having said that, there is a great deal of sensitivity in this country to what they perceive as the unlevel playing field between the U.S. and other countries and the adverse impact, rightly or wrongly, that trade has on jobs and wages here. And I think for my advice to other countries is to not try and wish that away, but to be sensitive to it and to develop initiatives that respect the importance of that any administration is going to put on protecting the American worker and farmer and rancher and company in this context. It's one reason why I think these issues like environmental goods, healthcare, digital trade create new opportunities to engage because they go beyond. And I think the willingness of countries to do things like raise their labor and environmental standards also goes a long way towards bridging the gap that's necessary to cross.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think this idea of a positive agenda around issues like healthcare, environment, and digital trade is something that could gain a lot of traction in going forward, and where many countries could probably relate to. Chad, any final remark on your side?
So what I would say is, I think what the last 4 years have taught me that we should all appreciate more is the role that the WTO plays in helping poor countries, small countries, the certainty in terms of basic non-discriminatory treatment. Even if you're not sort of one of the active leaders at the WTO, the role that that institution plays and the trading system plays for you, and access to dispute settlement when it works, as Mike indicated, is critical. And so kind of the best thing that a lot of countries could do is to try to improve the resilience of the WTO. And that may mean things like, don't obstruct, right? Let's do what we can to allow other things to get pushed forward so that we build a more resilient WTO and multilateral system. Because I think is fundamentally critical for poor countries especially.
I think that's an excellent point and an excellent way of concluding our session today. Thank you very much to Ambassador Michael Froman and Chad Bown for a great conversation. I definitely need to bring you back because we had over 50 questions from our audience, and I apologize to everyone because we of course could not take all of them, but I will make sure to send them to Mike and Chad so they can also think about some of your concerns and interest. Thank you very much for all of you in the audience, to my colleagues at Peterson as well for making TradeWinds possible. And stay tuned for our next episode of TradeWinds on Wednesday, December 2nd, where we will look into the future of India's trade and investment policies. So I'm sure that will be very interesting as well. So, and Mike, Chad, thank you very much. And to all of you, goodbye.